Hello there. I am glad you can make it today. Today's lesson comes from the book of 2 Kings, chapter 5, and in it we are continuing with the story of Elisha the prophet. And this one is a little bit different from some of the other stories of Elisha in that it really begins in a different country. Now, to the east of Israel, there was a country named Aram. And Aram was causing lots of problems for Israel. And part of that being that you may remember that the kings of Israel during the time of the split kingdoms were all bad guys, some worse than others, but essentially they were not following God, and therefore God was not protecting them. And you'd have countries like Aram that would send raiding parties into Israel, and those would be armed men who would go in and steal things or capture people and take them back. And in one case, they took back an Israelite girl as a slave. Well, she ended up becoming the servant or slave to the commander of the army of Aram. His name was Naaman. Now, the thing with Naaman was that he was a very good military commander, and his king thought highly of him, but Naaman had a problem. And the word that the Bible describes it can be translated as leprosy or some other type of skin disease. Now, leprosy, or whatever else it was that was wrong with his skin, was a major problem in Israel, in that if you separate yourself from the other people and you could not take part in religious ceremonies and you were considered unclean. So apparently in Aram they did not have quite the same level of strictness that the Israelites did, but still it was an uncomfortable situation for Naaman. And at best and at worst it would be something that would possibly progress and end up killing him in the long run. So while Naaman has this issue, the Jewish girl who is their slave says to Naaman's wife, "Oh, if he could only go to the prophet in Israel, he could be cured." Well, they didn't know about this, and a cure for diseases like this was just unknown. And so he thought, okay, she's sincere. She really did want him to be healed. And he went to his king and asked for permission to go to Israel to be cured. And so what that tells us is that Aram at this time had um, strength over Israel because they thought it was safe to let their commanding general go to Israel. The king, of course, said it was okay, and they gave him money to take to the prophet. And you wonder a little bit about this because there was a lot of silver and gold, enough to hire laborers for an entire year. And we're not talking about just a few laborers, we're talking about 600. So it's a lot of money, but he also takes 10 sets of clothing. And you think that's kind of odd until you realize that, oh, clothing was difficult to come by and very expensive to acquire. So taking 10 sets of clothing was a great gift in and of itself. So the king provides all of this. He sends Naaman along with a letter from himself, the king, to the king of Israel. Now, this leads to kind of a humorous incident, although nobody thought it was funny at the time, because Naaman gets there with the letter. They hand it over to the king of Israel, and he gets upset and tears his robes because there's no mention of the prophet in there. You see, the king of Aram no doubt thought that, well, surely if they have a great prophet who can perform this kind of cure, then he would be right there with the king. But you have to remember, Elisha is following God, and the king of Israel is not. So Elisha's not anywhere near the capital city of Samaria. Well, the king of Israel's upset because he thinks, oh, the king of Abraham is trying to pick a fight with me, and when we don't cure Naaman, then they'll start a war and attack us. And with some justification, he could believe that because Aram, even after this time, will cause Israel problems. But word gets to Elisha, and he sends a message up to the king of Israel and says, send him to me, send Naaman to me. Well, Naaman heads down there. Of course, he's not by himself. He has servants of his own. And they get to where Elisha lives, but Elisha doesn't come out to talk to them. He sends a servant down and says that Elisha says to go dip and wash in the river Jordan 7 times, and you'll be healed. And that's it. Servant goes away. Well, Naaman was expecting some big deal. He was thinking there would be some ceremony or some great pronouncement where the prophet Elisha would come out and wave his hand over him or say great things about God and all that. But no. And he's going, what's this? We have better rivers back in Damascus. What's the Jordan River? And he is angry, and he's not planning to do anything. But his servants start talking carefully to him, and they say, well, you know, if he had asked you to do some great thing, uh, wouldn't you have done it? And Naaman starts thinking and goes, yeah, I suppose I would. So he says, okay. He goes, dips in the Jordan. He does this 7 times. Now, the part we don't know is that was he doing this once a day, or was he dipping, coming out, and then going right back in? And really, that's not important for us to know, but we know that he does go through with what he's told to do. And he was told his skin would come out just like a newborn or like a little boy. And he, sure enough, comes out. And after that 7th time, his skin is clear. He no longer has the skin disease. And he is feeling great. He's fantastic. He's so thrilled with all of this. He goes back to Elisha's house, and he's trying to pay off Elisha, and Elisha's saying, no, I won't accept anything. You see, Elisha is not wanting to take any credit for doing anything to heal Naaman. It's all God who did that. And he finally convinces Naaman that he doesn't want anything in payment. And I have to stop here to say that often when people would go to speak to a prophet or a person working for God, they would take a gift to give to that person. So it was not unusual that Naaman would try to give it to him. And Elisha was not offended by this, but he was just making it clear that this act of God was being done for Naaman, and there was no cost to him. So with this, Naaman has a moment of thought, and he realizes that no other God that people prayed to could do this. And so he was convinced then and there that the real God was the only real God, and he asked to take back some of the soil from Israel to where he is going to be, and says that, hey, from now on, any sacrifices or worship I do will be to the Lord, meaning the real God. And he points out that, well, I'm required to help the king of Aram, and it sounds like the king of Aram's pretty old at this point and has a little trouble on his own. And so Naaman is required to let the king hold on to his arm as he goes and worships to his gods. And he's saying, please forgive me for doing this because I must help him, but my own worship is only going to be to the real God. And Elisha says, go in peace. So we get to the end of the story, although there's a little bit more on this that I'll get to in a minute. And what we see here is that Elisha is taking an opportunity to inform someone about God who is willing to listen. And I think that the big thing was he was doing it without any compensation from money or clothing or whatever. And that really gets somebody's attention. And that's something that we can do as well when we're talking to people about God. If we're doing things for them and able to tell them, I'm doing this for you because of God, and we aren't accepting anything in return for it, that will get their attention and give them something to think about. Now, in the story, there's a part near the end, and I am reluctant to say it because it kind of takes away a little bit of the goodness of the story. But after Naaman heads back, one of Elisha's servants thinks, man, we could have used some of that money. I would really like that for myself. And that's what it comes down to. He wants some of that money and clothing for himself. So he makes up a story. He takes off after Naaman, and when he catches up with him, he says, Elisha had a couple of prophets come and visit him, and he was wanting to know if he could have a couple of talents of silver and 2 sets of clothing. Well, actually, I think he asked for 1 talent of silver, and Naaman's so happy to do something for him, he gives him 2 talents of silver and 2 sets of clothing. And, I'm glad to do it, and he heads on back to Aram. Well, this servant goes back, and he hides what he has taken. But when he gets to where Elisha is, Elisha says, oh, where have you been? And he says, oh, nowhere. I haven't been anywhere. And Elisha says, I was with you when you stopped Naaman and took the silver and the clothing from him. And the leprosy that's left him will now be on you. Well, sure enough, this servant is now leprous. And where it may not have caused a lot of social problems in Aram, there's certainly those problems I mentioned earlier about being in Israel. And this servant is never going to be free from the leprosy due to his greed and his lying in all of this. So that's a little bit of a lesson to us in another way, too, is that we should not take credit for things God has done. We also should not try to profit from something that's been done in God's name. So with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. This is a story I really enjoyed because there's so many things we learned from it. And the tie I have today is to think that, okay, Naaman was a soldier, so I picked someone who looks a lot like a soldier in a fighting position. And that's how I came up with that for today. All right. I hope to see you next time. And otherwise, you have a good day. Bye.